The heat of the Nevada sun pressed down like a physical weight, baking the dust of the long road into the fine pink silk of her dress. Anna Lee held the folded paper in her hand, the edges softened with sweat, the ink a dark blue promise of ruin. Before her stood a simple cabin of weathered pine, its roofline stark against the endless, pale sky. A man was on the porch, watching her approach. He was broad in the shoulder and still, his face shadowed by the brim of a worn hat. This was Silas Croft's ranch, the place her husband's debt had sent her. The place she had come to end her life as a person and begin it as property. She stopped a dozen feet from the porch steps, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. In San Francisco, she had been a wife, respected in her small community. Here, she was nothing but the final payment on a foolish man's wager. She bowed her head, the traditional gesture of submission feeling hollow and foreign under this vast, empty sky. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice small but clear. "I am the widow of Way. My name is Anna Lee. I have come to settle his account." The man on the porch did not move for a long moment. He was taller than she had imagined, his frame lean but solid, built of the same tough material as the land around him. When he finally stepped forward into the unforgiving sunlight, she saw his face. It was not the face of a cruel man. It was weathered, lines etched around his eyes from squinting at the horizon, his jaw firm. His eyes, a startling clear blue, held a look of profound confusion. He came down the steps, his boots making a soft thud in the dust. He stopped before her, his gaze taking in her immaculate dress, a garment meant for city tea rooms and festival days, now coated in the grime of a week's travel by wagon and foot. "His account." Silas Croft's voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. "I believe there's been a mistake." Anna held out the paper. Her hand trembled, but she kept it steady. "There is no mistake. My husband, Wei, owed you a debt of $1,000. We had no money. This document states the terms of the collateral." She swallowed, the words tasting like ash. "The collateral is me. I am here to work for you until the debt is paid." Silas stared at the paper, then at her face. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his features, anger, perhaps, or disbelief. He did not take the document. "I run a cattle ranch, Mrs. Lee." "Not a slave market," he said, the words clipped and hard. "I never made such a deal with your husband." "But his name is here," she insisted, desperation threading her voice. "And yours. It is signed by Mr. Bartholomew Thorne, as witness." The name Thorne landed between them like a stone. Silas's jaw tightened. He finally took the paper from her, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. He unfolded it, his blue eyes scanning the legal script. The silence stretched, filled only by the buzz of insects and the distant lowing of cattle. He read it once, then a second time. A muscle worked in his cheek. Then, with a deliberate, almost violent motion, he tore the paper in half. He tore the halves into quarters, and the quarters into a flurry of small white pieces that fluttered to the dusty ground between them. "You owe me nothing," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "Your husband owed me nothing. Whatever game Thorne was playing, it ends now." Anna stared at the white scraps scattered in the dirt. The contract that had defined her entire existence for the past month, the document that had stripped her of her future, was gone. But its destruction didn't bring relief. It brought terror. Without the contract, what was she? A lone woman, a foreigner, with no money and nowhere to go, stranded in the middle of a territory that had no place for her. The debt had been a cage, but it had also been a destination. Now, she was simply lost. Tears she had refused to shed for weeks pricked at her eyes. "But, where will I go?" she whispered, the question aimed at the uncaring sky as much as at him. Silas looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, he seemed to see past the strange dress and the formal words. He saw the bone-deep weariness in her posture, the faint tremor in her hands, the sheer panic held tightly behind her dark eyes. He was a man accustomed to solitude, who had chosen this life to be free of complications. But the world had just delivered a complication of the highest order to his doorstep and torn up the instructions. He let out a long breath, scrubbing a hand over his face. "The next freight wagon to Redemption Gulch passes by in 3 days," he said, his tone more weary than unkind. "You can have the spare room in the cabin. You'll be safe here until then." He gestured toward the cabin with his hat. "Come on inside. You look like you're about to fall over." He didn't offer to help her, but he waited for her to move, a silent, implicit promise of safety. Anna looked from his steady, waiting form to the endless, hostile expanse of the territory around them. She had come here expecting a monster and found a man who valued his word over $1,000. She didn't understand him, but she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the greatest danger was not in this man's house. It was in the town of Redemption Gulch, with the man who had written the contract in the first place. The cabin was sparse but clean. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a simple table and 2 chairs sat in the center, and a narrow door led to what he called the spare room. It was little more than a closet with a cot, but it had a small window that looked out over the rolling, sun-bleached hills. For the next 3 days, they lived in a state of quiet, watchful truce. Anna, accustomed to work, could not sit idle. She found his mending basket and repaired the tears in his work shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She discovered a small, neglected patch of earth by the well and began coaxing life from it, her hands remembering the rhythm of her mother's garden. Silas watched her from a distance. He watched the efficient way she moved, the quiet dignity in her posture. He found himself leaving a bucket of fresh water by the garden patch in the mornings and ensuring the wood box by the stove was always full. They spoke little, but a language of small actions began to form between them. He would come in from the range, covered in dust and sweat, and find a plate of food left for him on the table, usually a simple stew she'd made from his stores. He started bringing back wildflowers from the high meadows and leaving them in a jar on the windowsill. He was a man of few words, but she began to learn his silences. There was the tired silence of a long day's work, the thoughtful silence as he stared into the fire at night, and the tense, coiled silence that fell whenever the town of Redemption Gulch was mentioned. On the 3rd day, the freight wagon was due. Silas hitched his own buckboard. "I need supplies," he announced, not looking at her. "It's best if I take you into town myself." The freighter, he works for Thorne. The unspoken message was clear, he didn't trust Thorne's man to transport her safely. The ride to town was dusty and hot. Redemption Gulch was a collection of false-fronted buildings huddled along a single muddy street, a place that felt temporary and mean. As Silas pulled the wagon up in front of the general store, a man stepped out onto the boardwalk. He was impeccably dressed in a dark suit, his face fleshy and pale, his smile thin and unpleasant. It was Bartholomew Thorne. "Croft," Thorne said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "I see my delivery arrived safely." His eyes slid over to Anna, a look of smug ownership in them that made her skin crawl. Silas's hands tightened on the reins. "She's no delivery, Thorne. She's a guest on my land. The debt is settled." Thorne chuckled, a low, condescending sound. "Is it now? You're a more generous man than I took you for, Croft. $1,000 is a steep price, even for such a delicate piece of property." He said the last word loud enough for the handful of loiterers on the street to hear, and they turned to stare, their faces a mixture of curiosity and contempt. Anna felt the heat of a dozen pairs of eyes on her. She felt stripped bare, her honor and humanity debated on a public street like the price of flour. She wanted to shrink, to disappear, but she met Thorne's gaze and held it, lifting her chin. "I am not property," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. Silas swung down from the buckboard, moving to stand between her and Thorne. He was not a large man compared to some of the brawlers in town, but he had a solidity to him, an unshakable presence. "The matter is closed, Thorne. Mrs. Lee is a free woman. She'll be taking the stage out of here as soon as it arrives." "Is that so?" Thorne's smile widened, but it didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "You see, there's a problem with that. That paper you tore up? It was just a copy. A courtesy. The original marker, the one that's legally binding in this territory, is filed with the clerk. And it's not made out to you, Croft. It's made out to me. Way owed me. I was merely sending her to your ranch for safekeeping. Until I had a place for her. The implication was vile and clear. Silas had not freed her. He had stolen Thorne's property. The loiterers were now a small crowd, drawn by the scent of conflict. They looked from the powerful town merchant to the quiet rancher, their loyalties plain. "You're a liar," Silas said, his voice dangerously low. "Am I?" Thorne shrugged, a picture of calm reason. "Go ask the clerk. The paper is there. Now, I am a reasonable man. You've had the use of her for a few days. I'll overlook that transgression. Just hand her over, and we can all go about our business." The world seemed to shrink to the space between the two men. Anna could feel the town's judgment pressing in on her. To them, she was an object, a prize, the source of the trouble. She saw the calculation in Silas's eyes. He could walk away. He could hand her over and return to his quiet life. He owed her nothing. He had already done more than any other man would have. But he didn't move. He stood his ground, a bulwark between her and Thorne. "She's not going anywhere with you," he said, and the simple words were a declaration of war. The ride back to the ranch was silent and heavy. The confrontation had changed everything. They were no longer a rancher and a temporary guest. They were allies in a conflict neither had sought. The sun was setting by the time they reached the cabin, painting the sky in brutal shades of orange and red. Inside, the air was thick with unspoken questions. Silas lit a lamp, the soft glow pushing back the encroaching darkness. He turned to face her, his expression grim. "He won't let this go," he said. "Thorne owns this town, the freight, the bank, the law. That clerk will say whatever Thorne pays him to say." Anna twisted the fabric of her sleeve in her hands. The shame and fear she had been holding back for weeks finally broke through. "This is my fault," she whispered. "I have brought this trouble to you. I should never have come." "This is not your fault," Silas said, his voice firm. "This is Thorne's doing." But he was right about one thing. "Your husband's debt, it wasn't to me. I loaned Way $200 once, for seed. He paid it back inside a month. We were square. So what was that $1,000 contract for?" The time for secrets was over. Anna took a deep breath, the truth a bitter pill she had to swallow before it poisoned them both. Way was a good man, but he had a weakness. He liked to gamble. Not with cards, but with promises. He believed he could talk his way into any deal, that the next big venture would make us rich. She walked over to the small window, looking out at the darkening land. Thorne approached him months ago. He knew Way had contacts with the railroad workers, men from our province. Thorne wanted to move goods without paying the freight taxes, silks, spices, opium. He wanted Way to arrange it. "Smuggling," Silas said, the single word hanging in the air. Way refused, Anna continued. He was foolish, but he was not a criminal. But he was also in debt to Thorne from other ventures, deals that had gone sour. Thorne drew up that contract. It wasn't for money. It was a service bond. If Way couldn't pay the $1,000, a sum Thorne knew we could never have, then my service would belong to him. Way signed it, certain he could find a way out. He never did. She turned back to face Silas, her eyes shimmering in the lamplight. "He died 2 months ago. His wagon went off the road into a ravine. They said it was an accident. She didn't have to say what she suspected. They both knew it was a lie. Thorne came to me with the contract. He said he was sending me to you as a kindness, to work off the debt in a respectable place. But it was a lie. He wanted me out of the way, isolated. And maybe he thought he could use me as leverage against you." "My spring," Silas said, a look of dawning comprehension on his face. "My land is the only property for 20 miles with a year-round spring. Thorne's freight teams need the water. He's tried to buy me out twice. Now it all made sense. The contract was a weapon with two edges, one to control her, the other to pressure him. Anna reached up and touched the small, intricately carved jade pendant that hung from a silken cord around her neck. It was cool against her warm skin. "My father gave this to me when I married," she said softly. "He told me it would keep me safe. I feel as though I have failed him, and my husband." Silas crossed the small room in 2 strides. He stopped in front of her, his presence filling the space. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat radiating from him. "You have failed no one, Anna," he said, using her name for the first time. It sounded different in his low voice, solid and real. "You have survived. That is more than most could do." He looked down at his own hands, calloused and scarred from years of work. "I came out here because I was tired of men like Thorn," he said, his voice quieter now, confessional. "My family is wealthy. Back east, they own banks and shipping lines. They buy and sell men's lives with contracts and handshakes, all polite and civilized. They wanted me to be one of them. I left. I wanted a life that was clean, something I built with my own hands. I suppose you can't ever run far enough." In that moment, the last of the barriers between them fell away. He was not just a rancher, he was a man who understood what it meant to be trapped by obligations you did not choose. And she was not just a widow in debt, she was a woman who had fought to keep her honor in a world that tried to strip it from her. A hard rap on the door shattered the quiet. Silas stiffened, moving instinctively to place himself in front of Anna. He opened the door a crack. 2 of Thorn's hired men stood on the porch, holding a lantern. One of them held up a piece of paper. "Message from Mr. Thorn," the man said with a smirk. "He's filed a legal claim on your water rights, Croft. Citing an outstanding business debt. Says you can clear it up by turning over his property." The threat was no longer veiled. It was a legal siege. Thorn would try to choke him out, ruin his ranch, and take everything. All because Silas Croft had shown a stranger a moment of decency. The next 3 months were a quiet war. Thorn cut off Silas's credit at the general store and spread rumors in town that Croft was harboring a fugitive, a thief. Freighters suddenly refused to carry his beef to the railhead. Silas grew leaner, his face more grim, but he did not waver. And Anna stayed. She became his partner in survival. Her garden flourished under her patient care, providing vegetables that supplemented their dwindling supplies. She learned to clean a rifle, to read the signs of the weather in the clouds. He taught her how to handle the horses, and she discovered a quiet joy in their steady, honest presence. They worked from sunup to sundown, side by side, their shared purpose forging a bond stronger than any contract. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes in a comfortable silence that was more intimate than words. He learned of her childhood in a coastal village, of her love for poetry and painting. She learned of his estrangement from his family, of his deep, abiding respect for the land. But Silas was not just working his ranch. One night, Anna found him hunched over the table, writing a letter by lamplight. It was addressed to a law firm in Boston. "Thorn thinks he's the only one who knows how to use paper as a weapon," Silas told her, a grim smile touching his lips. "It's time I reminded myself of the language my family speaks." He sent the letter, and another, by telegraph from a town 50 miles away, a long and risky ride. The day the U.S. Marshal arrived felt like the breaking of a long fever. He was a tall, stern man with eyes that missed nothing. He didn't ride in with a posse, just a single deputy, but he carried the weight of federal law with him. He came directly to the ranch, Silas's letter in his hand. He listened to Anna's story, his expression unreadable. He examined the legal claim Thorn had filed on the spring. Then he rode into Redemption Gulch. What happened next became the stuff of town legend. The marshal, armed with information from Silas's lawyers, didn't just question Thorn about the fraudulent contract. He started looking into Thorn's entire freight business, his tax records, his land acquisitions. He interviewed the railroad men Way had known. Under the unblinking gaze of federal authority, Thorn's empire of intimidation crumbled. Men who had been too afraid to speak before began to talk. The story of Way's accidental death was re-examined. 2 weeks later, Bartholomew Thorne was arrested, not just for attempted indenture, but for fraud, smuggling, and conspiracy. His power, built on fear and paper, evaporated overnight. The town of Redemption Gulch breathed a collective sigh of relief, suddenly eager to befriend the quiet rancher they had shunned. Summer had mellowed into the gold of early autumn. The air was crisp, and the sky was a deep, cloudless blue. Silas and Anna stood by the spring, the water bubbling up clear and cold from the earth. The legal challenges were gone, the deed to the land clear and solely in his name. In his hand, he held the small, torn pieces of the contract he had ripped up that first day. He had kept them, a reminder of the day his life had changed. He built a small fire, and together they watched the scraps of paper curl, blacken, and turn to ash, the ink of the cruel words vanishing forever. The smoke drifted up into the vast Nevada sky and disappeared. Silas turned to her. The lines of strain around his eyes had softened. He looked at her not as a problem to be solved or a person to be protected, but as his equal, his partner. "This is your home now, Anna," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "If you'll have it." It was not a declaration of love in the way the poets she read wrote about. It was something more solid, more real. It was a statement of fact. This place they had fought for, this life they had built together, was theirs. She reached up and touched the jade pendant at her throat. For so long it had felt like a symbol of her failure. Now, it felt like a connection to her past, a past that had, against all odds, led her here. She looked at his calloused hand, the hand that had torn up a contract, that had tended her garden, that had held a rifle to defend her. And without a word, she placed her hand in his. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.